Welcome to the 5th 2019 AViD event. I'm Steve Jane, president of the Des Moines Public Library Foundation Board. Since 2001, there have been 143 AViD events, attended by 48,107 people like you. AViD is possible with the leadership of Tim Palouche and the community engagement team and input from the volunteer selection committee. We appreciate the excellent staff at all Des Moines Public Library locations, enhancing the quality of our lives every day. The Des Moines Public Library Foundation and Executive Director Dory Briles raised the funds for AViD, summer reading and school readiness, programming for children, teens, and adults, and new public access computers. Foundation funding supports 87% of the library's free programming. Bringing outstanding authors for AViD, free programs, the latest technology, and improving the library collections takes more money than our tax dollars can provide. Please help us continue to make a difference with your gift to the library. And this is my prop here. This is a little envelope, and if you're so inclined, we'd like to have you put a little bit in there for the effort. A few details. Please complete the blue evaluation card. Turn it in at the information table out there for a chance to win an AViD journal and a signed copy of Nick Nolte's Rebel, Life Outside the Lines. It was appropriately named. Your evaluations help us secure AViD funding. Purchase a book from Beaverdale Books and have your book autographed by the author. 10% of sales are donated to the foundation. Thank you to the volunteers and sponsors who make AViD possible. Our premier sponsor, the Des Moines Register, Nationwide Foundation, Principal Financial Group, Brad and Kelly Edmeister, Humanities Iowa, a state-based affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cultivating Compassion, the Dr. Richard Deming Foundation, Mary Kay and Daniel M. Kelly Family Foundation, O'Brien Fitzpatrick Foundation, Karen Schaff and Steve Jane, Dr. Catherine and Andrew Hauser, Pamela Bass Bookie and Harry Bookie, Shelley and Martin Brody, Mary Ritchie, Douglas and Deborah West, Don Taylor, Judy Blank, Marianne and Robert Sobich. Now it is my pleasure now to introduce Sue Woody, the library director. A Des Moines native, Sue began her role as director in July of last year.
There we go. Good evening. I'm Sue Woody, and I would just like to welcome you all here tonight for this incredibly special AViD with Madeline Miller and this amazing book. If you haven't read it yet, trust me, by the end of tonight, you will want to read it. It's beautiful. Let me just tell you a little bit about it. Circe is a beautifully told reimagining of a slice of classic Greek mythology. It tells the story of Circe, the infamous witch and goddess from the Odyssey, mostly best known for turning men into pigs. But Madeline Miller's Circe is a complex protagonist with far more agency than Homer's version. No longer is she defined by her affair with Odysseus. Instead, she's a wise and underappreciated woman who is banished to an island, alone but liberated from the restrictions of her time. She's allowed to be independent and blossom and be away from the expectations of her father and societal norms. Madeline Miller earned her BA and her MA studying classics from Brown University. and she has taught and tutored Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare for the past 2 decades. Her first novel, The Song of Achilles, won the prestigious 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction, and that's now called the Women's Prize for Fiction, and that book has been translated into over 25 languages. Then along came Circe last year. This novel was a New York Times #1 bestseller, and it was just recently named a finalist for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Now, no one's ever won this award twice, by the way, but we are rooting for you, and I think you can do it. It's a beautiful book. The accolades for Circe are many. It won the Indies' Choice Best Fiction of the Year Award and the Best Audiobook of the Year Award. And it is truly a magnificent audiobook, and you can download that from the library or borrow it on CD. It was also won the 2018 Elle Big Book Award winner, the BookPage Book of the Year, and Paste Best Novel of 2018. Additionally, Circe appeared on dozens of Best of the Year lists, including NPR, Entertainment Weekly, Time, People, Buzzfeed, The Washington Post, and many more. And additionally, I would just like to say, I know a lot of you are reading this because for 2019, this is one of our top circulating titles of the library. So I know you're reading it and talking about it and can't wait to hear. And you will have an opportunity to ask Madeline some questions after her talk, so please fill out those little forms in your program, and when it comes time for the Q&A program, we'll pick them up and give them to the author. By Mary Kelly. Serving as our moderator tonight is Mary Kelly. Mary was once a children's librarian, and though she's now retired, she's no stranger to libraries still. She was a founding member of the Des Moines Public Library Foundation and is active in our library programs. She's also a generous supporter of AViD and the library, so thank you. And now at this time, I would like to welcome to the stage the wonderful Madeline Miller.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm an old high school teacher, so I have to come out. I can't be trapped behind a podium. Hello to all of you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Des Moines Public Library and the Foundation for having me. My mom was a librarian, so speaking at libraries always feels like coming home. So thank you for all your support for the library. So I wanted to start by reading a little bit, just a very short passage. And as Sue was saying about Circe, Circe is most well known for her appearance in Homer's Odyssey, where she turns Odysseus's men into pigs. She is the first witch in Western literature. And this passage that I'm going to read comes from towards the middle of the novel after she has already started doing the pig turning. Odysseus asked me once, "Why pigs?" We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide, with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. "Why not?" I said. He gave me a bare smile. "I mean it. I would like to know." I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden. This was his highest worship. There were answers in me. I felt them, buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall, when my lions were gone, and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them, scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all, their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. "Come," I would say to them. "It's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs. So one of the reasons that I always like to start off with a little reading actually goes back to Homer himself, if Homer really was a person, and we can get into that later in the question and answer. But the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad was composed sometime around 750 BCE, and the Odyssey sometime around 700 BCE. And I say composed very deliberately because these poems were originally out of oral tradition, and they would have been delivered by bards. And so people would have come to see them and they would have heard them. And so as I was writing both Circe and the Song of Achilles, since these were inspired by Homer, I wanted them to have an auditory presence. And oftentimes when I'm working on the novels, I will read bits of them out loud because I want to sort of honor that original heritage that they have coming out of Homer. Now, my relationship to Homer and to these Greek myths goes back all the way into my childhood. Starting when I was around 5 and 6 years old, that librarian mother of mine started to read me little pieces of the Iliad and the Odyssey as bedtime stories. She also now thinks it was really inappropriate. But I really loved them. And I actually have a memory of her reading the first line of the Iliad to me, which goes, "Sing, goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles, which brought so much grief to the Greeks." And I immediately wanted to know, who was this Achilles? Why was he so angry? Why is he hurting his own people? I was totally hooked into this story. So she continued to read to me all the Greek myths that I could find, and then once I could read for myself, I did my own reading. We were fortunate at the time to be living in New York City, so we would go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we would get to see their amazing antiquities collection. And they have just beautiful statues. There was one in particular that I would just stand in front of and stare at, which was a wounded Amazon warrior. Now, we think of these statues as being sort of that pure marble, very austere, very pale, very beautiful. In the ancient world, they were all painted. They were bright, bright colors. And so in this Amazon warrior that I loved, you could see the gash had been carved in her side. And in the ancient world, there just would have been like gushing red paint all down her side. And it's one of the things that I think is hardest for people to realize is that all these temples, all these statues, they were all painted in the brightest possible colors you can imagine. So I always like to mention that because I think it's the thing that people don't really know, and I didn't know at the time. Now, as I got older, I went off to high school, and I was very fortunate to have a wonderful Latin teacher who saw that I was obsessed with these stories. And he offered to teach me ancient Greek. I said, yes, sign me up. And so he and I worked together, and in about a year, I was able to start reading the Iliad. And I had thought that I had loved these stories before, but reading them in the original was a revelation for me. And so I knew going off that I wanted to continue to study this in college, and in fact, I did. Now, my first memory of Circe in particular doesn't go all the way back to my mom. I don't know if she read me the Circe section. I have a vivid memory of the Cyclops section. But I do remember Circe from 8th grade, which was when everyone in the 8th grade in English class read the Odyssey. And this was really exciting for me too, because it was the first time that I had my own copy of the Odyssey that was really mine. And I was highlighting, and I was writing in the margins. It was nerd heaven. And actually the other day I found this copy, and it's very embarrassing, and like the notes that I've written are. But I was really excited, and I was really excited about the Circe episode in particular, because the women of Greek mythology are in general just ciphers. The vast majority of them are literally just names. They're this person's mother and this person's daughter and this person's wife or sister, and if their story is really exciting, they might get to die. And that's kind of it. There are a few of these big characters like Medea or Clytemnestra. Sometimes Antigone gets put in that same category. People who kind of cause destruction. Usually they have to be punished for it by the end of their story. They have to die by the end of their story. But Circe managed to have power but not be punished for it. So that was very interesting. And I was also interested in the Circe episode because it's a very important moment in Odysseus' own journey. So Odysseus is the prince of Ithaca, and when Helen of Troy runs away / is stolen, depending on who you ask, all the Greek kings and princes and captains set out for Troy to try and get Helen back, and also to sack the city. Troy was one of the richest cities in the ancient world. And they spend 10 years there trying to get inside the city, and they can't do it. Finally, in the 10th year, Odysseus comes up with this idea of the Trojan horse. They build a giant wooden horse, hollow inside. They stuff it with Greek soldiers. The rest of the Greeks sail away and hide just out of sight as if they've gone. And the horse is left as if it's sort of an offering to the gods, a gift for the Trojans, and the Trojans fall for it. And they pull it inside the city, and they have a big celebration. Hooray, the Greeks are gone. And when they've all gone to sleep, the Greeks come out of the horse, they open the gates of the city, the rest of the Greeks come in, and they sack the city. Now, sacks of cities in the ancient world were ugly and brutal things. Absolutely all the men would have been killed, that includes the boys. The women and the girls would have been taken as slaves. Everything that could have been stripped would have been stripped, and everything else would have been burned. So after that, the Greeks leave Troy, their ships stuffed full of treasures, as conquerors. Now, 2 years later, Odysseus is still not home. And in that time, from having left Troy, he has lost 11 out of his 12 ships. All of his ships made it all the way through the war. All of his men pretty much seem to have made it all the way through the war. But in those 2 years after the war, he's lost 11 of them. That's over 500 men. It's a devastating loss, and he's lost them in the most horrific ways you can imagine. Eaten by the Cyclops, torn apart by cannibals, just death after brutality. And then he arrives, grieving, exhausted, in despair, with a god out there with a vendetta against him, on this lush and beautiful island. He goes to explore. He sees a little smoke drifting above the trees, and he decides to send some of his men to go see who lives here. Maybe they can help us. Maybe we can steal from them. If you know the Odyssey, you know Odysseus is basically a glorified pirate in a lot of the episodes of the Odyssey. In fact, that's why he gets into trouble with the Cyclops in the first place. He goes to the Cyclops' cave with his men, and his men are kind of like, everything here is really big. I think we should go. And Odysseus responds by saying, oh, no, we're going to get a really great gift. Let's hang out. Does not turn out well for him. And so what ends up happening is we don't really know the intentions, but they're definitely interested in who lives here. Maybe they can help. And so this group of Odysseus' men goes up, and they find this beautiful palatial home. And in the garden outside the home, there are tame lions and wolves just sort of hanging out. The men are a little disturbed by this, but they continue on to the door, and they knock at the door, and they're greeted by a beautiful goddess who says, come in, let me give you food, let me give you wine, which she has drugged. And as soon as they consume it, she casts her magical spell, turns them into pigs, and drives them out to her sty. Now, one of Odysseus' men has held back. Maybe he was tipped off by the tame lions. And he sees all this, and he goes running down to tell Odysseus, she's turned them all into pigs. So Odysseus has to go confront Circe. And on his way up to confront her, he's actually stopped by Hermes, who is the great trickster god and the god of travelers, and also an ancestor of Odysseus's. You can see they kind of share that tricksy, wily blood. And what Hermes says to Odysseus is, he says, this Circe is actually quite frightening and powerful, so I'm going to give you this herb that will make you immune to her spells. So Odysseus, armed with his herb, goes up to talk to Circe. And this was the moment that as a 13-year-old I was on the edge of my seat for, because I thought this is going to be a great scene. Odysseus is smart and interesting, and she's obviously smart and interesting, and they're going to have banter, and there's going to be a battle of wits, and she can finally stand up to him. It's going to be a really interesting scene. But what actually happens in the Odyssey in that moment is that she tries to turn him into a pig. It doesn't work. And he pulls his sword on her and threatens her. And she screams and falls to her knees and begs for mercy and invites him into her bed in basically one breath. And I was really mad. I was really mad, and I was really frustrated that, here's this really interesting female character, and all she gets is just that one that's it, and now she has to be literally put on her knees in front of the male hero. I understood that this is Odysseus' story, she's the obstacle, he's going on his journey, so of course he has to overcome her, but it just felt like such a missed opportunity that we couldn't just stay with her a little bit longer. And of course, it felt obviously very gendered. The phallic sword did not escape my notice. And so I sort of had this moment of like, well, what if this was really Circe's story? And I didn't know when I was 13 that would eventually become this novel, but I think, in fact, that was the seed. Now, as I went on and studied these things in college and in graduate school, I ended up returning to Circe's story many times because I ended up specializing in ancient poetry and ancient epic poetry in particular. As I came back to Circe as an older student, I noticed something else about her, which was that I thought she had gotten a really unfairly bad reputation. So mostly when people remember her, they remember the pigs, understandably. I think sometimes people also confuse her with Calypso, who is the other nymph in the Odyssey who sleeps with Odysseus on an island. So I understand, whose name begins with C. So I understand that confusion. But Calypso is the one who keeps Odysseus prisoner for 7 years against his will. But Circe, after that moment where she sort of, she and Odysseus come to an understanding, they do in fact become lovers. She says to him, I see that you and your men are exhausted. Stay on my island and heal for as long as you need to. And he takes her up on it. So he and his men stay for an entire year. And at the end of that year, Odysseus actually doesn't want to go, which is a huge thing, because Odysseus spends the whole Odyssey agitating to get home. He's always miserable. He's always thinking of Penelope and Ithaca. But Circe's island is the one place in the Odyssey that he doesn't want to leave. And so his men have to come to him and say, remember Ithaca, Penelope, are we going to head off? And he says, yes, you're right. And he goes to Circe and says, okay, it's time for me to leave. And she says, great. Here's what you need to know. First thing is you have to call this dead prophet out of the underworld. So here are the dimensions of the pit you're going to have to dig and the libations you're going to pour in. And she launches into this incredibly specific sort of knowledge that you could basically only get from someone who was a witch with a necromancer brother. And then after he does this sort of thing with the dead, he comes back to her again, and then she starts giving him all this advice about the monsters he has to pass, how to get past Scylla and Charybdis, how to get past the sirens, the bird women with their enchanting song that makes you mad, and then you crash your ship on their rocks, and then sometimes they eat you. So she's the one who comes up with the idea of put beeswax in your men's ears, so they won't be able to hear the sirens' enchanting song, and you'll be able to sail safely by. And she actually goes a step further than that, and she says, but you, Odysseus, you tie yourself to the mast and leave your ears free. And that way your men will carry you safely by. You won't be able to jump out of the boat, but you will be able to hear the siren song. And that just kept sticking with me because I thought, wow, she really understands him. That is exactly who Odysseus is, the great storyteller of the ancient world who would want to go home and say, I'm the only man alive who has ever heard the siren song and lived. He's going to dine out on that story for like the next 30 years. And she totally sees that about him. So that, just even little moments like that, I was thinking, wow, there's a relationship here. She has insight into his character. There's a friendship here of some kind. So those were all things that I wanted to think about, is sort of bringing back this balanced portrait of Circe, that she isn't just the villainous witch, the man-hater, the spider at the center of her web. She also has this benevolent healing side at the same time. And I really did want to push back against that pretty strongly, because I've talked about sort of her getting a bad reputation. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in particular, Circe was kind of a watchword for a terrifying woman. And oftentimes in those manuals about how to control your wife, Circe was the illustration for this is what happens if you don't. If women get power, men start getting turned into pigs. And so there was all this anxiety around her as a figure. And you can see that in both later interpretations and in Homer. So I wanted to kind of say, well, who is this? Who is this person? How does she have this kind of power? And most of all, I wanted to answer the million-dollar question, why is she turning men into pigs? Odysseus, the most curious man in ancient literature, doesn't ask her. And Homer doesn't tell us. And so we don't know why she's turning men into pigs. It's always been sort of treated in literature about her as if, like, well, you know how women are. They're evil. And, which is a totally uninteresting answer, particularly for a novelist. I think people do things for reasons, and even if we might have trouble understanding those reasons or identifying with them, they always have their reasons. And so one of the main things I wanted to think about with Circe is, how does she get to this moment when we see her in the Odyssey where she has all this power, and she's doing this thing that is pretty extreme, actually? And what would make someone do that? And that's really always been my interest in these stories, is that Homer, I think, implies psychology, but he doesn't really give psychology. He shows you sort of these larger-than-life people on a larger-than-life screen. You're never getting the Hamlet soliloquy of one of these characters. So part of what I love to do is kind of get in there and say, okay, here's what Homer has them doing. Now, who is the person that would make sense for all those things to be happening? How can I make sense of this person psychologically and really dive into that? Because at their heart, I think all of these stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and so many of these myths are really human. Yes, they have six-headed monsters and they have gods and destiny, but the Odyssey, at its core, is the story of an exhausted war veteran who is desperate to get home to his family. And that's what I love about them. And so when I was working on Circe's story, I wanted it to have that very human core. I thought a lot about witchcraft and what it meant to be a witch. And I mentioned that Circe is kind of the first witch in Western literature. So I did a lot of research into other portraits of witches kind of throughout literary history, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot of different types of witches. There's kind of the classic hag witch, that's the Macbeth, the weird sisters, double, toil and trouble. There's also the foreign witch. You can see that in Medea. You can also see that in Sycorax, the mother of Caliban in The Tempest, and in The Crucible, Tituba, the character. So, and foreign witches, there's this sort of like their witchcraft and their foreignness kind of combined to become one terrifying thing. Of course they're an evil witch, they're from someplace else. And so that was interesting. Circe is kind of in the sexy witch variety, which is definitely a strain. And I would argue also the good witch variety as well. And one of the most interesting things that I found out, which I will share with you all, which has absolutely nothing to do with classics, is that as I was thinking about witches, I stumbled across this early feminist whose name was Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Matilda Jocelyn Gage was sort of working with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was part of the early women's rights movement, but she was really interested in witches. And she was one of the first people who started to say, I think all this burning witches thing is not really about fighting the devil. I think this is about misogyny. And, which now sounds really obvious, but at the time was not. And she actually talked about witches in very positive light. And she said, these women who are being scapegoated were often women who had a lot of herb lore and herbal knowledge. They were kind of proto-doctors, but that knowledge also made them frightening. And so then when things went south, then they were the ones who were scapegoated. And so she talked about them as basically being early chemists or early scientists. But what's also interesting about her is that she had a son-in-law whose name was L. Frank Baum. And he wrote Glinda, the Good Witch, to honor her work. It turns out he was a huge feminist, and he wanted to kind of bring his mother-in-law's work into his book, which totally changed the way I read the whole Oz series. So I had to go back and reread it after that, which I always find really interesting, that good witches have been kind of with us from the beginning. The other thing that I thought a lot in terms of witchcraft is sort of, what does it mean really when we use the word witch? Obviously we're talking about spells, and you can see a lot of the stuff that Circe has a lot of those witchy attributes that will become common later on. She has a staff, kind of like a wand. Scholars actually debate whether or not she's using the staff to cast the spell or whether or not she's using it to drive the pigs. I actually sort of fall on the pig side, but she does have it and she brandishes it. She also has a relationship with animals. She has her lions and wolves, kind of like animal familiars. And then, of course, she has her relationship to the natural world, poisons, potions, that her witchcraft is not divine power. It's actually very distinct from her divine power. It's not, Shazam. It's, I have to grind this, I have to harvest it, I have to work with it. That witchcraft comes out of that tradition. But what it seemed to me that it really meant when we're referring to witches in literature is that what we're really talking about is women who have more power than society thinks they should have. They have an amount of power that makes society uncomfortable. And so that was something I wanted to explore with Circe. What's interesting also is how current that word still is. If you name any female politician across the spectrum and you Google their name and witch, you will go down a horrible rabbit hole. Don't do it. But we are still throwing that word at women who have power or who make us uncomfortable or who are kind of out being leaders. We still use it. So that was very interesting to me. I hadn't really realized how current it still was. And then the final thing is that whenever I am thinking about a character, part of what I wanted to do with Circe is just what I said when I was 13, is I wanted to set her at the center of the story. And so what that meant was I needed a lot of material that wasn't in the Odyssey at all, because she's just a cameo in the Odyssey. She just shows up very briefly, and then Odysseus sails off. And I wanted to completely flip that. She's in 2+ books of the Odyssey. Odysseus is in 2+ chapters of this novel. And I did that very deliberately. I thought, turnabout is fair play. Odysseus will expand to fill all available space, so I wanted to kind of keep him contained. But it turns out that Circe is actually a fascinating character, and she has this whole life, mythologically, that has nothing to do with Odysseus. She's the daughter of the sun god Helios. She's the aunt of the Minotaur. She's the aunt of Medea, the other great witch in ancient literature. And she's also cousin to Prometheus, the titan who brings fire and civilization to mankind. And this whole host of sort of other divinities she's related to as well. And so part of what I wanted to do in telling her story was focus on all these other parts of her. Who is she leading up to that, and who is she once Odysseus leaves again? And to really kind of tease all that out. And it was really interesting to do it because it was a very different exercise than with Song of Achilles. With Song of Achilles, there's so many myths about Achilles. But with Circe, there are really only 4 major myths. And everything else was me kind of filling in, inferring, drawing things out. So those of you who have read the book know that there is a dramatic Minotaur scene. I will tell you, as a writer, if you have the opportunity to write a Minotaur C-section scene, I think you have to take it. So I did. But that scene does not exist in ancient mythology, although it should. But Circe really is the sister of the mother of the Minotaur. And so it made sense to sort of include her in those moments. So I looked for moments like that where there was a possibility for her to be included naturally, even if the scene wasn't written in mythology. So I was kind of piecing together her life. And I always started with Homer. He's always sort of my touchstone. And Homer gave this really fascinating description of her, which just kind of hung around and hung around and hung around. And this is really the difference between approaching this stuff as a novelist and as an academic. And I don't sort of separate between like creative and non-creative, because I think academic writing is actually very creative, but in terms of not having to really prove your point and just allowing sort of things to kind of bubble up and germinate, and what's the thing that you just keep returning to. And one of the things that I kept returning to is this throwaway description Homer has of her, where he describes her as the dread goddess who speaks like a human. The dread goddess who speaks like a human. And that just caught me. What does that mean, to be a goddess who speaks like a human? You know, of course it implies that there's a way to speak like a god and a way to speak like a human, and that those are very different. And we know how gods speak from the ancient literature, because we see it in both Homer and in Virgil and in others, that when a god talks to you, when a god talks to a hero, the hero's hair stands on end. It's this like electrifying, terrifying experience. You fall down to your knees. You immediately offer, you know, your prayers to them. If the god doesn't, you know, has their divinity turned all the way up, you can even incinerate if Zeus appears in front of you. And so that's what it feels like. But Circe somehow doesn't have that. She talks like a human. So what does that mean? And I associated the ancient Greek gods, I have actually a very negative portrait of them. They were pretty horrendous if you look at the ancient mythology. They were petty and selfish. They held grudges. They were constantly obsessed with their own pleasure. Today we would call them sociopathic narcissists. And that's the family Circe's born into, as opposed to humanity, which we have our narcissists, but for the most part, humanity is actually capable of a lot more empathy than the gods are in the stories. And in fact, I think empathy is humanity's greatest gift and the literature's greatest gift. That's really what stories are, is they help grow empathy in the people who listen to them. You imagine yourself into someone else's life. And so I wanted empathy to be an important part of Circe's story, her humanity, that little detail that Homer gave me. Sometimes people ask me, what do you have to do to make the Greek myths relevant to modern day? And my answer is always nothing, absolutely nothing. Because when you start digging into the stories, the 3,000 years separating them and us just completely disappear. That, as I said, these are really stories about humanity. And they're stories about sort of people doing things. And you can see that Circe's experience as a woman in this world where she lives alone, that makes her a target. She's struggling to be heard. She's often kind of kept from the halls of power. She's ignored. She's undermined. All these things are things we are still, unfortunately, struggling with today. We've made some progress, but a lot of that is still out there. And I wanted to show some of those pressures that were on ancient and modern women, and also on ancient and modern men. That along with looking at all the ways that this society constricts women, I also wanted to look at sort of how some of the male characters are dealing with this. Because in a society that is, you know, constricting 50% of its population, it's not just going to be 50%. And so this brought me to Odysseus' son, Telemachus, who is an important piece of the novel. And I've always thought it would be very difficult to be Odysseus' son. And I wanted to look at sort of what does it mean if you don't want to be a hero like your father? What if you don't want to follow in the epic path? Can you make a different choice? What are the pressures on you? And in sort of looking at that, I was drawing actually not on an ancient work, but on a famous poem by Tennyson called Ulysses, which is Odysseus has come back home, he's defeated the suitors, he's taken back over Ithaca, and he's gotten bored. And now he wants to go out and have another adventure. And the poem itself is really inspiring. In fact, it's very quotable. It's drink life to the lees and strive to seek, to find, and not to yield. It's about Odysseus wanting to head out to the horizon, human curiosity, the human desire to know and to keep learning, all of which is very positive. But he also, as Odysseus is talking in this poem, he talks about Penelope as his aged wife. He doesn't even name his wife Penelope, the woman who waited for him for 20 years. He just calls her his aged wife. And then he talks about his son. And what he says about his son Telemachus is he says, well, Ithaca's really boring and Telemachus is boring, so that's great. Telemachus can stay home and deal with Ithaca, and I'll go out and have an adventure. And so that really kind of gave me, I didn't think I was going to use the poem as a source, but the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about it, I thought, yes, I see something here, there's something here. And so when I'm looking at these things, I talked about kind of Homer being, my touchstone, but I also throw open the doors, and I allow, lots of little bits from everywhere to go in. I'm a little bit of a magpie. So in the questions, if people do want to know about sources, I never lead with sources because I feel like sometimes people really don't want to know about my sources. But if you do ask the question, I can elaborate more about that. And there is a lot more that I can say about sort of myth and Circe and reframing, but I'm going to say one more thing and then I want to get to your questions because I hear you all are a great audience and you have really good questions. So the last thing I want to say is oftentimes people say, well, how do you feel like you have the right to tell these stories? These are culturally beloved touchstones. And I sort of have two answers, a general answer and a specific answer. The general answer is that actually retellings are as old as Homer himself. That these stories were originally told by multiple bards in different ways, and that as soon as even the Iliad and the Odyssey existed, they were being retold in Greek tragedy. They were being retold by the lyric poets, and of course, Virgil, the great fan fictionist of all time, writing the Aeneid, let's do it again, but from the Trojan perspective. So, this idea of retelling, the ancients would have absolutely recognized it because it was part of that tradition. Myths are not, there is no such thing as sort of a definitive myth. Myths live because they are retold and retold. And, I can't hurt Homer. He's going to be fine. But the specific answer to that question is actually also that I feel that in the case of Circe in particular, Homer is really inviting me in because in the Circe episode, the narrator is not Homer or whoever the bard is, it's Odysseus himself. Part of the Odyssey is told by Odysseus to some people he's staying with, and so he's telling that whole story. And when you start to realize that Odysseus is the one telling the Circe story, you start to realize how incredibly self-serving it is. It's like, oh, there was this terrifying witch, but then I totally tamed her, and then she threw herself at me, and she was super hot. And he goes on and on about how beautiful Circe is and how lovely she is, and Circe of the beautiful braids. But you realize, as he's doing this, the person he's really praising is himself. This really makes him look good. And so I thought, well, wow, Homer is really giving me this opportunity. Here is Circe. This is Odysseus's version. Odysseus, the great liar of ancient literature, who really, fibs his way across the Mediterranean. Why should I take him at his word? This could have happened in so many other ways. And so in the end, I also felt like Homer was kind of opening the door for this story. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you guys for questions.
That was wonderful. Can you all hear me? My name is Mary Kelly, and I'm delighted to be here this evening as your moderator. And you gave us such a wonderful introduction to the book that everything I have here has already been covered pretty much in terms of questions. But I will say this, could I have just members of the audience who are in book clubs, please raise their hands?
Oh my gosh,
Right,
thank you.
Right, this is the book club crowd. Yesterday we discussed Circe at my book club, and I have another book club that will be discussing it next week. And I will have to say that we probably had the very best discussions we could have still been there, right? Talking about questions and the relevancy today of the characters that we really found spoke to us as 21st century women. So I wanted to thank you for your comments about your mother, the librarian, because I also am a librarian and spend a lot of time at the library, but the stories you told about the introduction of the classics and how that really formulated your career, basically. I thought it was a wonderful story, and having just celebrated Mother's Day last week, she must be a very proud mother. So I'm glad you mentioned her. This book is what I would call a dense read. And by saying that, I mean that in a most complimentary way. It is not the kind of book that you can skim and get the gist of it. You have to read every word because it's so richly put together. And every sentence gives you insight into character or nature or whatever. So thank you for your beautiful, beautiful prose. I have several quotes here that resonated with me, and some of them that we talked about yesterday. And part of what I think is so rich about the character that you develop is that she was born into this world where most people, or most of the gods, were quite content with the world they lived in. I mean, why wouldn't they be? They could feast, they could, make mortals cringe at their very, act, and nymphs especially. And so there was a quote here that I thought was quite telling in terms of what their world was really like. And it's this: brides, nymphs were called, but that is not really how the world saw us. We were an endless feast laid out upon a table, beautiful and renewing, and so very bad at getting away. So Circe gets away. She's banished. Tell us about how that banishment served to help her develop.
So, as you say, Circe is a nymph, and in the world of Greek mythology, the world is incredibly hierarchical. And so up here at the very top, you have Zeus and Helios and Athena and Hera and Poseidon and all kind of the big names. And if you're one of those gods, life is pretty good. You basically get to do whatever you want. Occasionally the fates will get in the way, but pretty much, if you want to destroy something, you can destroy it. If you want to take something, you can take it. And then it goes on down through the ranks. Then there's sort of wind gods, and there are river gods, and there are the graces, and all the way down through these kind of infinite levels to the very, very bottom, which is where nymphs are. And in the mythology, nymphs are always the ones who are being assaulted, they're being raped, they're being passed off to husbands they don't want to marry. They have very, very little agency in their life. And I think it would be a terrible thing to be a nymph, and yet this is who Circe is born. And so part of what I was really interested in is, well, she's born that, but then we see her with all this power. What happens? And part of what happens is that she decides to invent her own power. She realizes this is a dead end. I'm not going to stay with that. I'm going to invent witchcraft. But also part of what happens is that she lives alone. And her exile, although it's kind of a traumatic event, actually turns out to be a wonderful thing for her, because alone she is able to really explore who she is and find out who she is away from all these threats from the gods around her, away from all the expectations placed on her. And in this I was really thinking of Virginia Woolf and A Room of One's Own, talking about how women artists and artists in general really need a space where you can have your own thoughts, where you can have your independence from those expectations, those pressures. Circe gets an island of her own, which is definitely an upgrade. But that is a core piece of why she's able to be the way she is. And I was thinking about Circe and her sister, Pasiphae, that mother of the Minotaur, who I can't believe she doesn't already have her own HBO miniseries. But her sister doesn't want to live on an island by herself. she wants to be the queen of Crete. She wants to be, to wield power in the world, to be able to stand up to her husband, to be able to sort of have, her subjects around her. And in order to do that, she basically has to terrify everybody so much that no one will mess with her. And so she is actually dealing with a lot of the same stuff that Circe is dealing with, but she has to choose this different path because she wants to be in the world. Whereas Circe wants to break with the world. She wants to make a new world, a new space where you don't have to do that. And so her exile was something that was, I think, really a core piece of the story from the beginning.
One of the things that hit me early on was her encounter with the punishment of Prometheus. And I think we saw right on that she was not a typical goddess or nymph because she really showed compassion. She gave him drink when he was thirsty, and broke all kinds of rules in doing that. So I think early on we learned that she had that human capacity to empathize, and we saw that develop throughout the book. She didn't turn all men into swine. She was judicious about who she did. So I think we learned that here was a woman that had, or a goddess, a nymph, that was apart from the world that she had born into. And so this continual evolution we saw with her. I think we better move on to some of the audience questions. Here's one. What advice can you give a senior in high school who's interested in studying classics? Do you have any significant memories of your time as a student?
So I don't know where you are, whoever that is, but if you love it, absolutely keep going with it. And college you're a senior in high school, is that right? Because college is going to open up all these new vistas in classics. There are so many wonderful classics professors out there who are really not only great scholars, but great teachers. And I hope that you will have some, and make sure that you read all the little course descriptions, the little reviews of is this a good professor, and take the classes with the best professor. I feel like I don't know who I'm talking to. So I think sometimes people get a little nervous about majoring in classics because they think, well, this is going to be like I'm not going to get a job. So I will pass on two sort of things about that. One is that I went on from I didn't know I was going to write novels about this and become a novelist. What I was going to do was teach in high school, which is a wonderful job if you love classics, and a wonderful way to keep classics alive and to kind of pass on the torch and keep it burning. But the other thing is I've actually heard from a lot of, this is going to sound really strange, but a lot of Wall Street hedge fund managers, computer people, marketing people who are all like, oh, we always hire the classicists because they know how to think. So I pass that out there in case. But I would also say that, I am a huge proponent of the liberal arts. And I think that, even if there isn't a job where you can use your classics, that these stories, whether or not you're taking classics or whether or not you're taking, poetry in, Spanish poetry or whatever liberal arts subject you're taking, that all this stuff will continue to feed you for your whole life. And it will make you... So I highly recommend it. Keep loving it.
We talked about this at book club yesterday. The Odysseus sort of personality that he was a very difficult person, obviously, to be around, and was very, as you mentioned, prideful. But we thought a lot of what he exhibited and as men exhibited was what today we would call post-traumatic stress. And so were you thinking about modern day soldiers coming back from the wars that we have seen in our lifetime as you were rethinking the story as well?
Absolutely. So the name for PTSD is new. But the idea of PTSD and the experience of PTSD is very, very old. And the ancients made it very clear that they understood it. You can see it in the tragedy Philoctetes, you can see it in the tragedy Ajax. In fact, there are a number of modern organizations that read those plays in particular with veterans returning from war because they find it so relevant and resonant with their own experiences. So the ancients, the ancient Greeks were constantly waging war. So there were a much larger percentage of the population were veterans. So it was something that was very much in the public eye. And I would even argue that the end of the Odyssey itself deals with PTSD a little bit, because you have Odysseus having come home from 20 years of horror, 10 years of the war, and then 10 years of suffering. He's lost all his men. He's the only one who makes it out. And then he lands on the island, and there are these suitors who have been kind of besieging his wife. They've been threatening his son. They've been eating all his stores. They've been trying to get Penelope to marry one of them. They're saying, he's never coming back, marry one of us. And in the world of Greek mythology, it kind of makes sense for Odysseus to slaughter them all, which is what he does. And that sort of feels fair and within the rules. But then he goes on and he kills all the men who helped them. And then he kills the women who were slaves, who were forced to sleep with them and didn't have a choice about that. And then he goes on, when their families show up and say, hey, you just killed all our sons, to start killing them as well. And what you can see in that moment, I think, and I think a lot of people have seen, is sort of, he is used to dealing with the Cyclops. And now he's come home to his little island, and I think he's struggling a little bit to re-enter his old life and to sort of respond not with that overwhelming threat. There's a wonderful book actually all about this called Odysseus in America by a wonderful writer whose name is Jonathan Shea. He is a psychiatrist who works with Vietnam veterans and has for a long time, but he also loves classics. And so as he was reading the Odyssey, he was sort of saying, this sounds like what I'm hearing from all these veterans from Vietnam. And he actually, a lot of the book is him sort of putting, stories from Vietnam veterans and passages of the Odyssey next to each other, and it's really amazing. As I said, the difference in time just completely collapses. And I think there are sort of two things I was thinking about with Odysseus in particular. One is this sort of idea of, the trauma of living through all that brutality and sort of having to be in this survival mode for so long. But also, there is a group of people who are just really good at war. They actually thrive in war. And when we see Odysseus in the Iliad, which is sort of the Trojan War poem, he is thriving. And he, in fact, becomes, he is named best of the Greeks. And he gains fame for what he can do. And what is it like for someone who has actually thrived in that situation to then go home and herd goats? Is that possible? It would certainly be challenging. And so those were things I was absolutely thinking about. And so I was reading modern veteran narratives, but I was also reading ancient veteran narratives, and stories about ancient veterans, because I think these are things we've been dealing with for a long time.
I know in the art world they say all art is contemporary, meaning that when we look back on what we now consider classic art, at one time that was contemporary, and this really resonates. As you said, you don't have to do anything to bring it up to date. It really speaks for itself. But I do have a question about how you think Circe would view the Me Too movement.
So one of the eeriest experiences of my life was to be in final edits for Circe while all the Me Too stuff was breaking. I would be working on a scene, I would check the news, it would be exactly what I had been writing about. I would move to another scene, I would check the news, it was that scene also. And I had always passionately believed that this was incredibly relevant, but seeing it play out in real time was really disturbing. I think she would certainly, I I think Circe sees a lot of the things, she sees women who are not believed. She herself is not believed at some points in the novel. When I think about Me Too, actually, the character I think about is yes, Circe, but also the character of Cassandra, who, there is a character with absolutely no time between the ancient world and today. Here is a woman who a man, the god Apollo, tries to rape her. She refuses him. He curses her to always tell the truth and never be believed. And what I think a lot of women can experience, have experienced that of trying to tell your story and no one will listen to you. So I see, the connections again between the ancient and the modern world as being very, very close.
Very, very relevant. And as you say, you have to really do nothing to make it resonate today. Have you considered writing about Medea?
Medea, as I said, is Circe's, in some versions of the mythology, is Circe's niece, and so she is in my novel. I feel like I got to have my little Medea exploration, and actually that scene, there is a scene in the novel, it's kind of a spoiler, but it is also a 3,000-year-old source, so I don't know if that counts. But there is an ancient piece of literature that we have called the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes, which is all about Jason going to get the golden fleece. And Medea is there. She's actually the daughter of the king who controls the golden fleece, and her father is Circe's brother. And he's awful, and he's sort of this like sorcerer king character. And he gives Jason a series of quests that are designed to kill him, and as opposed to let him win the golden fleece. And so Medea falls in love with Jason, and she decides to help him. And Medea and Jason then flee with the fleece, with Aeetes, Medea's father, in hot pursuit to get the fleece back and his daughter back. And in the story, they do something really horrible, because Medea has, I guess, thought ahead and brought her brother with her when she escapes. And she says, what would really slow my father down? If we cut my brother up into little pieces and threw them over the side, then he'd have to stop and pick them all up. Jason says, great idea. So they do this. They throw the pieces over. Greek mythology is gruesome. The father does indeed stop to pick them up, and Circe and Medea and Jason get away. However, Medea and Jason in the Argonautica are now suffering from blood pollution. They have committed this sort of blood crime on a relative. And so they have this miasma around them. That's actually a Greek word, miasma. It means blood pollution. And so they stop off on Circe's island to be purified. And Medea does not reveal who she is, and she does not reveal what they have done until after it's kind of all accounted for. So I knew I was going to use that source, and I knew I was going to write that scene. And although we know that they show up on Circe's island, the conversation between Circe and Medea is not really recorded, and so I was going to, that was all my imagination. So I sort of feel like I got to dip my toe into Medea, and I'm not sure I'm going to go back for right now. I think there's so many wonderful retellings of her story. But she's not the character that's really possessing me. I feel like I got to have my little Medea moment. The thing about her that really I found interesting in terms of writing Circe is two things. One is that I think she's very young when all this happens. She would have been 15, 16. So that was interesting to me, but also the fact that she and Circe have actually suffered from a lot of the same things. They both have horrendous fathers. They've suffered from abuse as children. And what happens for people who do that in their childhood is sometimes that actually makes you more empathetic and more aware of other people's suffering. And that's kind of the path that Circe has taken. But Medea has kind of taken I have to strike first, because if I don't, I'm going to be the one who's getting hit. And so she goes this other direction of, the best defense is a good offense. And so I was interested in the fact that they have this similarity, but they have taken such divergent paths.
What is next for you? And please say a Hades and Persephone retelling.
Hades and Persephone is an amazing story, I agree, because there are so many different ways to look at it. Is Demeter the amazing mother who goes to the ends of the earth to find her daughter, or is she, totally controlling and a helicopter parent? I feel like you can see, and Persephone is trying to escape from that. There's so many different lenses to look at that. And if you are interested in Hades and Persephone, I highly recommend the Louise Gluck poems that are in Averno. Which is her collection that deals with that. So they're wonderful and really interesting. So no plans for Hades and Persephone right now, but I totally think it's a great story, and there's can never be enough versions of it. So if any of you out there are thinking, I empower you to write it. I have two things I'm thinking about next. I didn't really talk about this today, but kind of the other piece of my education that has been incredibly inspiring for me is theater, and Shakespeare in particular. And what actually caused me to connect classics and writing was theater. I directed a production of Troilus and Cressida, which is Shakespeare's version of the Iliad. And so all these characters are in it: Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Ajax, and Shakespeare lets them all have it. It's a vicious, nasty, funny, bitter play. It's great. I highly recommend it. And so that was really kind of that launched me on this whole other career of directing Shakespeare plays, which I credit with teaching me a lot about storytelling in general. But I have been thinking about The Tempest for a really long time. And so The Tempest has sort of been, it's also about magic and witches and islands, so it's been kind of germinating in the background. And then at the same time, the Aeneid, Virgil's great poem, epic poem, is the other sort of ancient love of my life. So at some point, hopefully both of those, not sure which first.
Do you think, you've had a lot of experience teaching young people, do you think today they are being taught, and that you obviously have taught them because you taught the classics, but generally speaking, do you think there's an emphasis on the classics today? And if so, do children or students respond well to them?
I think classics is having a little bit of a resurgence, which is nice. I'm so excited that Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey is out there. If any of you are looking to maybe, yes, I agree. She is brilliant, and the translation is brilliant, and it captures the excitingness of Homer. I think people sometimes forget that these were things that people went to go see on purpose. But she really captures how fun and exciting and suspenseful. And, I found myself, obviously the Odyssey is a text I know very well, but I was reading her and I was like, oh, is Odysseus going to get out of this? And so I knew she had done a good job. And I think that should honestly be the translation that is read in schools now. And I think it would bring a lot of people into the story and be much more accessible. I mean, one of the things that I think is really frustrating for me as a teacher of classics is that lots of times I think people are kind of intimidated by the classics, and they see it as this elite thing, and I can't understand it, and I'm not sure I can say the names, which I totally understand. First of all, we don't have any recordings of ancient Greek, so, we have reconstructed pronunciation, but I encourage you all to just go for it with the names. You're probably hitting some version of them. But in terms of that, Homer himself was not elite at all. As I said, this is all oral tradition. This is stuff, parents are telling their children, grandparents are telling, that it really belonged to everybody. And so I love that Emily Wilson's translation, I hope, can kind of bring that back, bring that accessibility back, and the fact that these are for everybody. Because I do think that certain translations can kind of be very distancing. So I'm very hopeful that there's a little bit of a resurgence. And I have always found that when students come in my classroom on the first day and they're like, I don't know about the Aeneid, this is going to be really bad. But as soon as you start telling the stories, they totally get it. They immediately get the connections between the ancient world and the modern world, and they see themselves in the stories. So I have never had a class that didn't respond.
How could they not respond to her? That's what I want to know. If I had you as my teacher. Really? Okay, so this is the last audience question. In regards to the story of Achilles, did you feel opposition from other people writing a queer love story with classic subjects?
So the relationship, Song of Achilles is narrated by Patroclus, who is Achilles' closest companion. He's called the most beloved companion of Achilles by Homer. And their relationship has basically been debated pretty much since the Iliad existed. And sort of the two basic camps are, Homer doesn't say that they're lovers, therefore they're not. Homer doesn't explicitly say they're lovers because it would have been so obvious to an ancient audience that they didn't have to say so. And you can see in the ancient world, both interpretations are totally out there. Plato takes them as lovers. We have a fragment of a lost Aeschylus tragedy with Achilles mourning over Patroclus' body. Sorry, that's a big spoiler. Patroclus dies. Achilles mourning over Patroclus' body and talking about their frequent kisses, so that's clearly an interpretation where they're lovers. Xenophon, the historian, said no, they're the closest of friends, not lovers. So, but both traditions absolutely existed in the ancient world. And I felt, based on my reading of the Iliad, that Achilles' grief for Patroclus feels so physical. He holds the body all night. He embraces it. He, presses kisses on it. It's very physical mourning, and just the way that happens. And he wants their ashes to be mingled together in an urn after they're dead. And so, in my reading, I sort of, that's what resonated with me, is to take them as lovers. And I also felt frustrated by the fact that tradition, that interpretation, had basically dropped out. I was not seeing it taught. I was not seeing it referenced. I felt like it had been kind of, basically closeted. And so I wanted to, bring that interpretation back as a way to look at their relationship and to make the case for that. My editor said, I want you to be prepared for hate mail. I am happy to say I have received less than 4 pieces of hate mail in my entire life. For the most part, people were incredibly supportive. I was thrilled with how supportive they were. And I think classicists were actually leading the charge on being supportive, because classicists know that that is totally within the tradition and a valid interpretation. So it was very important for me. I would not have written that book any other way except with their love story at the center. And I was thrilled that I received such minimal pushback. It was really very heartening, actually.
Well, and I think that's a statement of how far we've come also. I mean, to think that at one time that may have been a controversial thing for you to venture into, and your editors were still worried, but good that it turned out as it did. Let's see, what else have we not covered? Did you have a colicky baby?
I'm so glad you asked. So one of the things that was really important for me to talk about is in the world of ancient epic poetry, women are not put at the center, because epic poetry is traditionally very male, and traditionally very male things are the subject of epic poetry. War, inheritance, vengeance, patrimony, all these things that belonged in, the male and female spheres were very separated in the ancient world, and those things belonged to the male world. So things that are female are not really considered important enough for epic, including things like gardening, crafts, parenting. And I knew I really wanted to bring all those things to the fore and kind of give them their epic due. I cannot imagine, a more epic thing than birth. If you've lived through it, if you've supported someone through it, if you've seen someone who's recently given birth, it is an epic, life-changing, high-stakes experience. And so I really wanted that to be part of Circe's story, because in the mythology, she is a mother. And I wanted to give it its proper weight. Even goddesses struggle with babies screaming at 3 a.m. in the morning. I am very lucky that my children are not demigods. But certainly as I was writing that, I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. So walking with a screaming infant was viscerally very with me as I was writing those sections.
Well, we felt it yesterday at book club, because those of us who had one definitely related to that. And yes, it was powerful because it resonated with all those who knew about that. I would just say that what you have done with this book does make it so humanly connective to men, women. We just thank you for the beautiful way that you wrote it, and that it is making mythology alive again for so many people. I have one question about two things, about the cover of the book, and it's a beautiful, beautiful cover. And did you have any say in that?
So they had sent me an initial cover. By the way, most authors don't have a say. You sort of get to like offer input, but not have veto power. But they had sent me an original cover that was kind of very pale. It was like marble and austere. And I looked at it and I was like, I don't know, could we try something else, please? And so they're like, okay, all right, we'll take one more shot at it. And then this is what they came back with. And I was like, done, you're finished. So I gave it a little push, but they came up with it themselves, and I was thrilled.
Okay, well, I think it also draws you in. Okay, we can wrap up, is what this says. Well, we could go on and on. I know you think you're headed off to Philadelphia tomorrow, but we do have a plan. We'd like to send you to a very deserted island. We think that would prompt you to write a sequel rather quickly, not necessarily a sequel, but your next book. But we would send you off with a handful of companions' books. Can you tell us what they might be? In saying goodbye, which books would you want with you?
Well, one of them have not even finished, but it has vaulted into my favorite books of all time, which is The Overstory. I don't know if any of you have read it. Please read it. I feel like I'm in tears on every other page. I mean, if you read it, if you look up the description of it, it's like this is about trees, but it's about so much more than trees. So you must read it. It is beautiful and just mind-blowing. So I think I'd have to bring The Overstory with me. I would absolutely bring the Aeneid, of course. I think I would read one of the books I've loved since I was a child was Watership Down. I think I'd have to bring Watership Down, good old Watership Down. Just goes to show even bunnies can be epic. My complete works of Shakespeare.
Oh, that counts for more than one.
Also, maybe the complete works of Toni Morrison and James Baldwin. And The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been delightful.
Thank you all so much.
I've been looking forward to this ever since I got called. There are refreshments out in the foyer, book signing here. We thank the Beaverdale Books for being here. And you will sign books as well. And don't forget the last of the AViD series coming up, Cheevers, next week. Thank you.